Throughout the long and winding story of human civilization, food has been both a blessing and a curse. To eat is to live about, as the centuries have proven again and again. To eat is also to gamble, to risk, to court disaster and death with every unfamiliar berry, every new dish, every strange animal. Food, after all, is not merely nourishment, but a constant adventure, sometimes a treacherous one, filled with uncertainty, fear, and the very real possibility of poisoning, lurking in unexpected places hidden beneath the surface of what seemed, at first, so harmless. From the first foraging humans, cautious yet desperate, scanning the landscape for something edible, to the kings and queens presiding over banquets whose tables might hold both delicacies and doom, people have always flirted with danger in their pursuit of sustenance. Long before the discovery of bacteria, long before microscopes or pasteurization or expiration dates, the act of eating was a leap of faith to trust that the roots, fruits, grains, and meats on offer would sustain and not destroy, the hope that each meal would not be the last. Human ingenuity, curiosity, and, sometimes, sheer recklessness led countless generations to experiment with new fruits to try what their ancestors had never dared, to adapt to new environments by consuming whatever they could find. Sometimes they discovered new flavors, nutrients, and comforts, and just as often they discovered suffering, sickness, even death, the price of knowledge written in pain and memory. There were berries that promised sweetness but delivered agony, mushrooms that offered a feast but demanded a prize, fish that looked harmless but harbored deadly toxins. Bread, that most basic of human inventions, could harbor invisible mold that, when ingested, twisted minds and destroyed bodies, all while appearing wholesome and safe. Milk, beloved by many, was often a vector for disease and disaster, especially when unpasteurized, especially when left to fester in the warmth of summer, the line between nourishment and harm thinner than most ever realized. Society learned, over millennia, through trial and error, mostly error, what was safe and what was not, what could be eaten with confidence and what should be left to the birds and beasts. Entire cultures developed elaborate rituals, taboos, and superstitions around eating, driven by the invisible threat that lurked in every meal, each custom a faint echo of an ancient tragedy, each warning a lesson paid for dearly. It is this journey, the perilous, sometimes gruesome, always fascinating story of the most dangerous foods people have eaten that unfolds in these pages, a tale filled with courage and folly, with suffering and survival, with poison and antidote. So, dear reader, settle in as we travel through time, from ancient forests to medieval banqueting halls, from peasant kitchens to royal feasts, tracing the shadowy line between nourishment and death, exploring a world where every bite carried a risk, every meal was a story, and survival was never guaranteed. It is perhaps fitting that, in the earliest chapters of human history, the greatest dangers lay not in swords or wild beasts, but in the very plants that grew beneath people's feet, in the mushrooms that flourished in shaded groves, in the berries that gleamed temptingly among the leaves. For our distant ancestors, knowledge of what to eat and what to avoid was not written in books, but learned through hard experience, sometimes at the ultimate price, a lesson etched in sorrow and loss. Take, for example, the humble mushroom, a source of both nourishment and nightmare, revered and feared in equal measure. In many cultures, mushrooms have been gathered with reverence, treated as delicacies, but always tasted with hesitation, for the woods were filled with edible varieties that were nearly indistinguishable from their lethal counterparts, the difference between a nourishing meal and a death sentence as subtle as the color of a gilt, the shape of a cap, or the faintest bruising on a stalk. In ancient Rome, stories abounded of whole families perishing after a misidentified mushroom was added to the pot, the deadly Amanita phalloides, the infamous death cap claiming the lives of peasants and princes alike, its poison working slowly, cruelly, imitating the symptoms of common illness until it was far too late to save the victim. Berries, too, were both food and full, their bright colors inviting, their dangers hidden. Children in the countryside were taught from the earliest age which fruits to pick and which to leave untouched, but mistakes happened, and more than one curious child fell victim to the deadly nightshade, whose shiny, inviting berries concealed a deadly alkaloid, a lesson in caution learned too late. Other plants of foxglove, hemlock, yew grew in fields and forests, sometimes cultivated for medicinal purposes, sometimes creeping unnoticed among crops, always carrying the risk of a tragic accident, a hidden menace in an otherwise bountiful landscape. Even roots, which seemed safe enough, could prove deadly. The story of the potato in Europe is instructive. When first introduced, many, unsure which parts were edible, consumed the green, toxic parts of the plant, resulting in outbreaks of illness and confusion. In South America, indigenous peoples learned, over centuries, to detoxify certain wild tubers with elaborate preparation, boiling and soaking them to leach away their natural poisons. In the Old World, however, that knowledge was often lacking, and the result was confusion, fear, and sometimes fatal consequences, a simple meal turning into a tragedy. Knowledge was precious, passed down through generations, often shrouded in superstition and myth. There were old wives' tales about boiling or burning away poison, about the phases of the moon or the alignment of the stars making a berry safe or unsafe, rituals and beliefs that sometimes saved lives and sometimes did nothing at all. Yet hunger often overcame caution, and necessity compelled people to risk eating what they did not understand, starvation a more immediate threat than the distant possibility of poisoning. So, families would forage, would experiment, would try new things, and sometimes would pay the price. The catalogue of dangerous fruits and the catalogue of deaths growing longer with each generation. Over time, knowledge spread, and people learned to avoid the most deadly plants and fungi, but the risk never vanished. Even today, people die from eating the wrong mushroom, from trusting the wrong route, from mistaking beauty for safety. The lessons of history written in tragedy and survival remind us that the earth, for all its bounty, is also filled with peril, a world where every meal is a story, and every story a lesson hard learned. The waters of the world have always been a source of both abundance and terror, for beneath the shimmering surfaces of rivers, lakes, and seas lurk creatures whose very flesh can spell death for the unwary. Long before the mysteries of marine toxins were understood, people ventured forth in search of food, drawing fish and shellfish from their native waters with little more than hope to shield them from danger. Yet time and again, what seemed like a simple catch would turn into a fatal meal, a lesson in humility delivered by the silent, invisible forces of nature. In warm coastal regions, the dangers of seafood poisoning became infamous, their effects feared and whispered about among fishing communities. Shellfish, in particular, pose a silent threat, their ability to filter and accumulate microscopic toxins from algae transforming them, without warning, into deadly morsels. Paralytic shellfish poisoning, a curse as old as seafaring itself, would strike without mercy, rendering its victims helpless, their muscles failing, their breath growing short, life ebbing away in a matter of hours. In some places, entire villages learned to heed the signs of the colour of the water, the time of year, the patterns of wind and tide, but such wisdom was always imperfect, and the price of ignorance or desperation was often paid in suffering and loss. The ocean offered other, more subtle menaces. The flesh of certain tropical fish, unremarkable in appearance, concealed psychiatric sins invisible, tasteless, impossible to detect by smell or sight. The symptoms of psychiatric poisoning were as varied as they were dreadful: burning pain in the limbs, hallucinations, a reversal of hot and cold sensations, weeks or months of lingering misery. Fishermen told stories of entire families stricken after a single meal, of storms that drove poisoned fish into new waters, of old men who would never touch a barracuda, no matter how hungry they became. In colder regions, the dangers were different, but no less real. The pufferfish, or fugu, became both a delicacy and a death sentence in Japan, its organs harboring tetrodotoxin, a compound so lethal that even the smallest mistake in preparation could kill. Over centuries, chefs learned to disassemble the fish with surgical precision, training for years. Their hands steady, their minds focused, the tiniest slip carrying consequences too terrible to contemplate. Yet accidents occurred, and every season brought new stories of lives cut short by hubris or inexperience, of feasts that ended not in celebration, but in tragedy. The rivers, too, held their perils. In South America and Africa, the habit of eating raw or undercooked fish exposed countless people to parasitic infections, some of which caused blindness, convulsions, or a slow wasting away. The knowledge that certain species, at certain times, carried invisible dangers became woven into local folklore, passed down in warnings and tales meant to protect the next generation. But hunger, as ever, made people take risks, and the invisible threat remained, a constant shadow over every meal. Yet despite all these dangers, the bounty of the water was too precious to abandon. People learned, little by little, to recognize the signs, to cook their catch thoroughly, to observe the rhythms of the natural world. Still, even the most careful among them could be undone by forces they did not see, by toxins that slipped past their vigilance. The story of dangerous foods, then, is also the story of survival in the face of uncertainty, of courage and loss, of the unending effort to balance risk and reward at the table. Bread at the staff of life, the daily sustenance of untold millions, was never as innocent as it seemed. In ancient and medieval times, and indeed well into the modern era, the making and eating of bread was shadowed by dangers invisible to the naked eye. Moles, fungi, and ergot, a parasitic fungus that infects grains like rye, could transform a loaf of bread from a symbol of comfort into a vehicle for horror, disease, and even mass hysteria. The story of ergot is a tale as strange as any myth, its effects so bizarre and terrifying that those who suffered its wrath sometimes believed themselves cursed or possessed. When rye and other grains were harvested in damp conditions, or stored improperly, ergot would take root, a slender, black sclerotia blending in among the kernels, often escaping notice. Ground into flour and baked into bread, the fungus unleashed its toxic alkaloids upon those who ate it. The result was ergotism, a disease that came in two forms, each more dreadful than the last. In some, the toxins caused convulsions, hallucinations, and a burning sensation in the limbs so intense it became known as St. Anthony's fire. Victims writhed in agony, their muscles contorted, their skin blistering, their minds slipping away on a tide of delirium. In others, the blood vessels constricted, cutting off circulation, turning fingers and toes black, rotting away flesh while the sufferers remained painfully aware, watching in horror as their own bodies betrayed them. Entire communities, in medieval Europe and beyond, were struck by outbreaks of ergotism, the cause remaining a mystery for centuries, attributed variously to witchcraft, divine punishment, or the malice of unseen enemies. Bread carried other risks as well. Moles, growing silently in sacks of grain or on loaves left too long in the heat, could produce mycotoxins that sickened those who ate them, causing nausea, weakness, or chronic illness. In times of famine, when hunger drove people to consume whatever was at hand, even spoiled or contaminated bread found its way to the table, the need for sustenance overriding the fear of illness. The story of bread, then, is also a story of desperation, of families eking out a meager existence, grateful for even the roughest, darkest loaf, unaware that their hunger might bring with it suffering of another kind. Still, bread was a necessity, and so people learned to take precautions where they could to dry and store their grain with care to recognize the warning signs of tainted flour. Yet even the most diligent could be undone by a season of rain, a failed harvest, a mistaken storage. The dangers of bread, like so many other foods, were a reminder that survival depended not just on work and luck, but on knowledge hard-won through generations of trial and error. The great feasts and banquets of history, scenes of laughter, song, and abundance were often tinged with danger, their glittering opulence concealing risks that could bring down even the mightiest of rulers. Among the candles and gold, the delicate dishes and rare wines, there lurked threats both accidental and deliberate, for the table was a stage not only for celebration but for intrigue, ambition, and sometimes murder. Royal courts were especially perilous, their kitchens staffed by dozens, sometimes hundreds of cooks, servants, and tasters. Food travelled great distances to grace the tables of kings and queens, passing through many hands, exposed at every step to the possibility of contamination or sabotage. The fear of poisoning haunted the powerful, leading to elaborate precautions, official tasters sampling every dish, silver utensils believed to change colour in the presence of toxins, antidotes kept close at hand. Despite all these measures, history records countless cases where poison slipped through the defences, a drop of deadly extract in a cup of wine, a sprinkle of white powder atop a favourite dessert. Not all dangers were the result of malice. The complexity of royal feasts, with their exotic ingredients and intricate recipes, created opportunities for accidental poisonings, the use of unfamiliar plants or spices leading to unexpected consequences. Chefs experimented with new flavors, sometimes drawing from apothecary stores stocked with both medicines and poisons, the line between the two often blurred. Medicinal herbs used to calm the nerves or aid digestion could prove harmful in large quantities, and the desire to impress with novelty sometimes overshadowed caution. The sheer scale of these banquets, the volume of food prepared and consumed, increased the risk of spoilage and contamination. Dishes that sat for hours before being served, meats kept without refrigeration, sauces thickened with raw eggs or cream, all could harbour bacteria invisible to the eye, waiting to unleash illness on unsuspecting guests. The stories of royal feasts cut short by outbreaks of vomiting and fever, of nobles struck down by food poisoning, are scattered throughout the chronicles of Europe and beyond, reminders that even the most privileged were not immune to the perils of the table. Yet the allure of abundance, the desire to display power and wealth, ensured that feasts remained a central part of royal life, and so, too, did the risks. The history of dangerous foods is, in part, the history of human ambition, the pursuit of pleasure and prestige balanced always against the shadow of mortality, the unspoken knowledge that the next bite might be the last. Across the world and throughout history, people have embraced traditions and foods that, to the modern mind, seem reckless or even unthinkable. The desire to preserve, to create, to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary has given rise to culinary practices that, while ingenious, have often walked a razor's edge between nourishment and harm. Blood, fermented fish, and cheese crawling with living creatures all have been eaten with relish and ceremony, the dangers accepted, sometimes even celebrated, in a pursuit of flavour and sustenance. In many cultures, blood was not merely a byproduct but a prized ingredient, rich in nutrients and symbolic of life itself. Sausages, puddings, and stews made with fresh animal blood graced the tables of peasants and nobles alike. Yet blood is a fragile thing, prone to spoilage, teeming with bacteria if not handled with care. In times before refrigeration and modern hygiene, the preparation and storage of such foods required vigilance, and mistakes could prove costly. Tales abound of festivals marred by outbreaks of illness, of whole villages laid low after a communal meal gone wrong, the very dish meant to unite and nourish instead sowing sickness and fear. Fermentation, that ancient art of transforming the raw into the remarkable, offered both delights and dangers. In Scandinavia, the tradition of surster emming of fermented herring, varied for months until it achieved a pungency both revered and reviled, was not without risk. Improper fermentation could allow the growth of deadly bacteria, rendering the fish toxic, the line between delicacy and disaster razor thin. Similar stories could be told of other fermented foods. Cheese is studded with live maggots, a specialty in parts of Italy, or kimchi prepared in the open air, exposed to the winds of nature. Each of these foods relied on skill, experience, and a measure of luck to ensure safety, each carried with it the possibility of harm. Cheese itself, so central to the diets of many peoples, was a source of both pride and peril. Made from raw milk and aged in cold, dark cellars, early cheeses harbored bacteria and molds that could bring pleasure or pain. Outbreaks of listeria, brucellosis, and other diseases swept through communities, their origins often mysterious, the causes debated by healers and housewives alike. Yet cheese remained beloved, its dangers accepted, its flavors irresistible. These traditions, passed down through generations, are a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, the willingness to take risks in the search for nourishment and meaning. The history of dangerous foods is, in this sense, a history of courage and creativity, of people pushing the boundaries of what could be eaten, of what could be survived, in the endless dance between hunger and hope. Milk, the first food of mammals, has long been associated with health, growth, and comfort, yet it has also been the source of some of the most insidious dangers in the history of human eating. For centuries, people consumed milk and dairy products without understanding the invisible threats they carried, the bacteria and pathogens that could turn a glass of nourishment into a cup of illness, a wedge of cheese into a vehicle for disease. Before the advent of pasteurization, milk was often consumed raw, straight from the animal, or left to ferment and sour in the warm air of kitchens and barns. In such conditions, it became a perfect breeding ground for bacteria, tuberculosis, brucellosis, listeria, and salmonella, to name only a few. Outbreaks of milk-borne illness were common, particularly in crowded cities, where dairy herds were kept in unsanitary conditions, and milk was transported in open containers, exposed to dust, insects, and filth. Children, the elderly, and the sick were especially vulnerable, their bodies ill-equipped to fight off the infections that lurk in the everyday staple. Cheese and butter, though longer lasting than fresh milk, were not immune to these dangers. The process of making cheese could either eliminate harmful bacteria or, if done carelessly, amplify them. Aging in damp cellars or caves encouraged the growth of molds and other organisms, some benign, others deadly. Stories of families struck down after eating a cherished wheel of cheese, of towns gripped by mysterious fevers traced back to the dairy, fill the annals of rural life, reminders of the risks that came with every creamy mouthful. Efforts to make milk safer boiling, fermenting, adding herbs or spices had mixed success. Superstitions flourished, with some believing that milk collected at certain times or under specific astrological signs was less likely to spoil, or that a charm or prayer could ward off sickness. In reality, only the arrival of modern science, with its understanding of microbes and its development of pasteurization, would finally bring safety to the milk supply, transforming a once dangerous staple into the symbol of purity it is today. But the memory of those dangers lingers, a testament to the long struggle to master the art of eating, to the price paid in suffering and loss for every advance in knowledge and safety. The history of dangerous foods is, in the end, a history of learning, slow, painful, and always unfinished. Long before the discoveries of germ theory and refrigeration, long before the world understood the subtle workings of bacteria and decay, meat was a treasure fraught with peril, a luxury whose consumption was always shadowed by risk. In ages past, when hunting was uncertain and livestock rare, every cut of meat was precious, every meal a celebration, yet the means to preserve, to transport, to cook meat safely were primitive at best, and so, too often, the very food that promised strength and joy brought only sickness and death. Spoilage was the constant enemy, especially in times of heat, humidity, or famine. Without ice or sealed storage, meat began to rot almost as soon as it was butchered, its surface crawling with invisible life, its odor masked or excused by hunger. Preservation techniques, such as salting, drying, smoking, and pickling, were ingenious but never infallible. Salted meat could harbor parasites or botulism if mishandled, smoke cuts might hide decay beneath a blackened crust, dry flesh could attract insects, mold, or simply lose its flavor and nourishment. In desperate times, when choices were few, families ate what they had, scraping away green spots, boiling away bad smells, whispering prayers that the meal would not be their last. Diseases carried by meat, whether animal-borne or fostered by unsanitary kitchens, were legion. Trichinosis from undercooked pork, tapeworms from beef, anthrax from the hides of animals, even simple food poisoning all were facts of life accepted with resignation and only dimly understood. Stories circulated of entire villages stricken after a communal feast, of butchers and cooks taken ill, of outbreaks that swept through armies and towns with terrifying speed. Some communities responded with caution, instituting taboos on certain meats, rituals of blessing or inspection, or customs of communal eating, so that no one person would suffer alone. Yet such measures, grounded as much in superstition as in science, could only offer partial protection, and the toll of sickness continued year after year, generation after generation. Fish, too, presented their own hazards, especially when caught from stagnant waters or eaten raw. Parasites flourished, toxins accumulated, and careless preparation could bring swift, deadly consequences. Yet, as with meat, hunger and tradition proved stronger than caution, and so, across continents and centuries, people sat down to meals that might well be their last, trusting in luck, in faith, and in the wisdom of elders whose memories were marked by both joy and tragedy. Hygiene, a concept slow to take root, was another line of defense, albeit a weak one. Hands unwashed, knives wiped on aprons, wooden bowls scarred by decades of use of these were the tools of the kitchen, their dangers as familiar as their comfort. With every meal, with every preparation, the boundary between life and death was redrawn, sometimes crossed without warning. Over time, knowledge accumulated, hard-won and uneven, shaped by suffering and survival. Cooks learned to boil water, to cook meat thoroughly, to trust their noses and their instincts. But even the most careful could be betrayed by fate, by a spoiled joint overlooked, a fly in the soup, a hand not quite clean. The history of food safety is the history of 1,000 small victories, each shadowed by loss, each marking the slow, uneven progress of humanity towards a world in which eating is less a gamble, more a comfort, but never without risk. Even the drinks that accompany meals, the water and wine that flowed so freely at table, carry dangers as profound as any fruit, their clarity or sparkle concealing threats that, through ignorance or neglect, could fell the strongest and most fortunate. Water, the essence of life, was often a vector for death, a courier of disease, filth, and corruption in cities and villages alike. Wine, beer, and spirits, though safer by virtue of the alcohol, brought risks of their own, not only through excess but through the hidden hands of adulteration, spoilage, and human error. For much of history, potable water was a rarity. Rivers and wells, especially in crowded settlements, were tainted by sewage, waste, and the runoff of daily life. People drank what they could find, boiling when possible, but more often trusting to chance, to habit, or to the hope that their stomachs, hardened by years of exposure, would endure what others could not. The result was a litany of waterborne plagues of cholera, dysentery, typhoid that swept through populations with grim regularity, leaving death and misery in their wake. Wine and beer, their fermentation a natural purifier, became staples for all ages and classes, a safer alternative to water, yet not without their own perils. In times before regulation, unscrupulous merchants of desperate households might stretch wine with water, sweeten it with lead or honey, or store it in vats lined with toxic metals. The dangers of lead poisoning, though only dimly understood, cast a long shadow over the tables of Rome and other ancient cities, their effects visible in the madness and decline of emperors and commoners alike. Spoiled wine turned to vinegar might be masked with spices or sugar, its dangers hidden behind a veil of taste. Beer, brewed in every village, was likewise at risk, its ingredients sometimes contaminated, its storage vulnerable to moles and spoilage. Efforts to improve the flavor or strength led to the use of unsafe additives, from herbs to chemicals, each bringing its own set of risks. Spirits, too, distilled with care or recklessness, could blind or kill if mishandled, the line between celebration and disaster as thin as a drop. The culture of drinking, shaped by necessity as much as by pleasure, reflected these dangers. Toasts to health, rituals of sharing, the careful pouring of a first cup for the gods or the dead all were gestures of hope and caution, acknowledgments of the perils that lingered in every sip. Only with the advent of modern science, with its purification, its regulation, its understanding of toxins and bacteria, did the risks of drinking recede but never entirely disappear. The memory of poisoned wells and tainted wines indoors, a reminder that the dangers of the table are not confined to solid food, that the story of what we drink is as fraught with peril as the story of what we eat. In every age, in every culture, the search for safe, sustaining drink has been as urgent, as difficult, as the search for nourishing food, a testament to the fragility of life and the endurance of hope. As explorers ventured across oceans, as empires rose and fell, as new lands were discovered and old ones transformed, the world of food was thrown into tumult, its risks magnified by novelty, ignorance, and the collision of cultures. The age of exploration, with its promise of abundance and adventure, brought not only new ingredients but new dangers, for the unfamiliar was always a double-edged sword, its potential for delight matched by its potential for harm. When European settlers first encountered the potato, the tomato, the cassava, they saw in these crops a possibility of ending hunger, of feeding the multitudes. Yet their lack of knowledge of which parts were edible, of how to prepare and store them, of the toxins that lurked within led to tragedy after tragedy. Green potatoes, rich in solanine, brought sickness and confusion to those who ate them uncooked or unripe. Cassava, a staple across Africa and the Americas, was safe only when carefully peeled, soaked, and cooked, its flesh otherwise laden with cyanide, invisible, tasteless, deadly. Tomatoes, shunned at first for their resemblance to poisonous nightshades, were embraced only gradually, and always with caution. The movement of people brought other, subtler threats. Foods once harmless became dangerous in new environments, where unfamiliar soils, climates, or pests altered their chemistry. Allergies and intolerances emerged as populations mingled, new illnesses traced to old staples. The spread of colonialism introduced diseases as well as crops, with smallpox, measles, and other plagues carried on ships as surely as spices or sugar. Nor were the risks confined to the conquered. Colonizers, in their ignorance or arrogance, consumed local plants and animals without understanding, sometimes with fatal results. The exploration of Australia and the Pacific, of the Amazon and the Arctic, is filled with stories of men struck down by berries, fish, or roots they mistook for familiar foods, the price of hubris paid in suffering and loss. Trade, too, became a vector for danger. As foods travel farther and faster, the risks multiplied by distance and time. Spices adulterated with toxic fillers, grains infested with pests, teas laced with dyes or chemicals all made their way into markets and kitchens, the dangers hidden behind exotic names and unfamiliar forms. Only through vigilance, through painful experience, did societies learn to protect themselves, to separate the nourishing from the lethal, the promise of abundance from the threat of disaster. In this world of constant change, the dangers of food were ever present, a reminder that curiosity, while essential to survival, must always be tempered by caution, that the journey from field to table is never without peril. The story of dangerous foods is, in this sense, a story of adaptation, of learning and forgetting, of the endless dance between the known and the unknown, between safety and risk. Modernity, with its marvels of science and technology, has transformed the landscape of food, rendering many of the old dangers obsolete, yet it has also introduced new risks, some subtle, some insidious, that continue to challenge the human quest for nourishment and safety. The supermarket, the restaurant, the gleaming kitchen, all these symbols of progress conceal vulnerabilities of their own, the legacy of history never fully erased. Preservatives, pesticides, artificial flavors, and colors, each innovation designed to protect or enhance food bring with them uncertainties. Their long-term effects debated, their safety measured in probabilities rather than certainties. Outbreaks of foodborne illness, though rarer than in the past, still kept tracing their origins to industrial farms, processing plants, or global supply chains, the scale of modern production magnifying the consequences of every error or oversight. Antibiotics, miracle cures in the world of medicine, have found their way into the food supply, their overuse in livestock fostering the rise of resistant bacteria, a threat that grows with every passing year. Hormones, genetically modified organisms, and other products of science raise questions as old as eating itself. What is natural? What is safe? What risks are worth taking in the pursuit of plenty? Yet even as technology advances, some of the oldest dangers persist. Poor sanitation, ignorance, and poverty continue to foster outbreaks of disease in many parts of the world. The globalization of cuisine, the constant search for novelty and excitement, sometimes leads people to foods whose risks are poorly understood, to traditions that, though ancient, are no less dangerous for their age. The memory of the past lingers in the present. Every recall of tainted lettuce, every headline about contaminated meat, every warning about unsafe imports is a reminder that the struggle for safe, sustaining food is never finished, that progress is always partial, always uncertain. The dangers may be fewer, but they are not gone, and the story of eating remains a story of vigilance, of adaptation, of the fragile balance between hunger and health. In this world of plenty, where the risks are hidden but real, the lessons of history are more important than ever, their wisdom a shield against complacency, a guide for the uncertain journey from field to fork. To eat is still to take a chance to trust in the unseen, to balance hope and caution with every bite, every meal, every day. The long journey through the history of dangerous foods reveals not only the ingenuity and resilience of humanity, but also its vulnerability, its willingness to gamble, to hope, to persist in the face of danger. From the first foragers to the shoppers of the modern supermarket, the act of eating has been an act of faith, a wager on the future, a testament to the complexity and fragility of life. Every culture, every era has its own stories of risk and survival, its own catalogue of tragedies and triumphs. The deadly mushrooms of the forest, the spoiled meats of the market, the poisons of politics and the hazards of hope all have shaped the human experience. All have left their mark on memory and tradition. Through suffering, people have learned, slowly and imperfectly, to recognize the signs of danger, to value knowledge and caution, to cherish the meals that nourish without harm. Yet the risk is never wholly gone. New dangers arise as old ones fade, new foods bring new challenges, and the boundary between safety and peril is always shifting. The legacy of the past endures, a warning and a guide, a reminder that to eat is to live, but also to risk, to trust, to believe in the possibility of tomorrow. In the end, the story of dangerous foods is the story of humanity itself, its curiosity and courage, its suffering and joy, its endless search for meaning and sustenance in a world both generous and treacherous. To sit at the table, to break bread, to share a meal, is to partake in a history as old as time, a history written in both delight and despair, in hope and in hunger. So let us remember, as we savor the abundance of the present, the lessons of the past, the dangers that once haunted every bite, the triumphs that made each meal possible. Let us eat with gratitude, with humility, with the knowledge that every feast, every simple supper, is a miracle hard won, a fragile gift, a story still unfolding. Yet the journey through perilous foods is far from exhausted, for even within each era and every land, individual stories, small tragedies, and accidental discoveries continue to accumulate, each one a brushstroke in the broader portrait of human survival and adaptation. Among peasants and nobles, in bustling cities and isolated hamlets, the lessons learned at the table were both deeply personal and universally shared, handed down in whispers, warnings, and customs shaped by fear as much as by hope. Consider the story of famine years, when crops failed and options dwindled, when the line between what was food and what was not blurred beyond recognition. In such times, people were forced to experiment, turning to roots and barks, weeds and wild plants whose properties were uncertain. Hunger suppressed caution, and so many consumed what their ancestors had wisely avoided. Some plants, like wild turnips, could be made edible only after hours of soaking and boiling, their toxins diluted but not always eliminated. Others, such as acorns and chestnuts, demanded careful leaching to remove bitterness and poison, a process requiring labor and patience in short supply. In northern Europe, the infamous bread of famine was baked from mixtures of bark, moss, and lichen, ingredients that staved off starvation but brought their own dangers. Bitter compounds, persistent moles, or undetected fungi often led to illness, and yet, in the absence of alternatives, these makeshift loaves became both a testament to resilience and a source of suffering. The annals of history are filled with accounts of swollen bellies, aching joints, and hallucinations, symptoms of poisoning disguised as the effects of hunger. Those who survived passed down knowledge as warnings, their memories shaping the taste and taboos of generations to come. Animal foods, too, became a source of peril in desperate times. During sieges or winters of want, towns would consume the flesh of dogs, horses, even rats, each new meat carrying new risks, new opportunities for disease. In some regions, people gathered snails, frogs, or insects, sources of protein but also of parasites and toxins. The methods of cooking and preparation, developed through endless trial and error, were as important as the foods themselves, for a mistake could turn sustenance into poison. Nor were the dangers limited to the poor. In periods of abundance, when novelty and display were prized above caution, the rich indulged in exotic delicacies imported from distant lands, unaware that the very foods they celebrated might harbour threats unknown at home. Birds preserved in acai sauces, shellfish shipped across hundreds of miles without cooling, sweetmeats coloured with dangerous dyes all found their way to the tables of those eager to impress, and all too often resulted in sickness, scandal, or worse. The story of dangerous foods, then, is not only a tale of human ignorance, but of ingenuity, of the countless ways people tried to tame the hazards of their environment, to transform what was dangerous into what was safe, to survive, to adapt, to flourish. For every fatal mistake, there was a lesson, a tradition, a recipe passed down and refined. It is in these small acts of perseverance that the larger history takes shape, a mosaic of risk and resilience, of caution and curiosity, written not in books but in kitchens, fields, and markets, day after day, generation after generation. Certain foods became infamous not only for their dangers, but for the rituals and superstitions that grew up around them, elaborate customs born of necessity, uncertainty, and the desire to control fate in a world that offered few guarantees. The process of preparing these foods, whether plant, animal, or otherwise, was often shrouded in secrecy and reverence, every step imbued with meaning, every gesture a prayer for safety. Among the most striking examples were the elaborate precautions surrounding the consumption of potentially poisonous plants. In parts of Asia and South America, families gathered for the seasonal harvest of wild tubers or seeds, their preparation overseen by elders whose knowledge was both respected and feared. Roots were peeled with special knives, soaked in running water for days, then boiled and roasted over open fires. Songs were sung, charms recited, not only to mark the occasion but to appease the spirits believed to dwell within the plants themselves. Failure to observe the correct sequence, a missed day of soaking, a broken tradition, was said to invite illness or misfortune. In Japan, the preparation of fugu, the pufferfish, rose to the level of an art, its dangers acknowledged in law and ritual alike. Only licensed chefs, trained for years, were permitted to slice the deadly flesh, their hands steady, their nerves tested by the knowledge that the slightest slip could mean death for themselves or their guests. The first bite, often offered to the chef, was both a gesture of trust and a test of skill. Despite the risks, or perhaps because of them, fugu remained a delicacy, its dangers woven into the fabric of its enjoyment, a testament to the human fascination with the forbidden. Other foods, though less lethal, inspired their own traditions. The first wild mushrooms of spring were gathered with caution, their identity checked and rechecked by elders and herbalists. In Eastern Europe, the arrival of the first strawberries or new potatoes prompted festivals of Thanksgiving, a collective relief that the cycle of risk had ended in survival. In every case, the ritual served not only to reduce danger, but to remind all who participated of the thin line between safety and peril, the knowledge passed down through hardship, of the importance of community in the face of uncertainty. These customs, far from being mere superstition, were often the result of hard-won experience, the wisdom of ancestors encoded in songs, ceremonies, and prohibitions. They offered comfort, a sense of control, in a world governed by chance and necessity. Even today, as science replaces myth and tradition, echoes of these rituals persist, a living reminder of the dangers that once haunted every meal, and of the resilience required to face them. Perhaps the most profound lesson from the long history of dangerous foods is the remarkable adaptability of the human body and spirit. Across continents and centuries, people have not only survived the hazards of their diets, but have, in many cases, developed ways to thrive, transforming dangers into delicacies, turning threats into sources of pleasure, pride, and even celebration. In some parts of the world, low-level exposure to certain toxins has led to the evolution of partial immunity or tolerance. Communities that have consumed mildly toxic plants for generations, cassava in Africa and South America, for example, have developed not only cultural practices to render them safe, but also, in some cases, physiological adaptations that allow them to process small amounts of poison without harm. The same is true of populations accustomed to fermented or spoiled foods, whose digestive systems, shaped by years of gradual exposure, are more robust than those of outsiders. Fermentation itself is a testament to human ingenuity, a method born of necessity that became a cornerstone of global cuisine. By harnessing the power of bacteria and yeast, people learned to preserve fruit, to enhance its flavor, to render the unsafe edible. Cheese, yogurt, sauerkraut, kimchi, and countless other staples are the legacy of this innovation, each the product of generations of careful experimentation and adaptation. Nor is adaptability limited to biology or technique. The ability to learn from mistakes, to share knowledge, to build upon the successes and failures of the past is perhaps the greatest strength of humankind. The proverbs and taboos, the recipes and rituals, the stories of illness and survival all are forms of memory mechanisms for transmitting the hard lessons of history across time and space. They remind each new generation of what is at stake, of what has been lost and gained, of the ongoing dance between curiosity and caution. In the end, the story of dangerous foods is not one of defeat, but of endurance, and a testament to the creative, stubborn, endlessly adaptive nature of those who have come before us. Through suffering and innovation, through risk and resolve, people have transformed the hazards of their environment into the richness of their culture, ensuring that, for all its dangers, the act of eating remains a celebration of life itself. Beyond the grand narratives of discovery and survival, the story of dangerous foods is also filled with small, almost invisible moments, the daily choices made by ordinary people, the quick calculations of risk and reward, the subtle negotiations between necessity and fear. In crowded city markets and remote village lanes, each transaction was a gamble, every meal a testament to both courage and resignation. Sellers praised the freshness of their produce, buyers relied on their senses, their intuition sharpened by a lifetime of experience and often by painful memories. The senses themselves became tools of survival, honed by repetition and reinforced by caution. The smell of sour milk, the sight of greenish tinge on bread, the feel of slimy fish scales or sticky meat all signaled danger, all demanded decisions that could mean the difference between health and sickness. In many households, the matriarch or the eldest, those whose judgment was most trusted, was the final arbiter, their approval or suspicion respected by all. Yet even the sharpest nose or most watchful eye could be deceived, and so accidents continue, their causes often mysterious, their consequences woven into family lore. In some cultures, the act of sharing food became itself a safeguard, a way to diffuse risk across many. Communal meals, in which everyone partook of the same dishes, offered strange comfort. If danger lurked within, at least no one would face it alone. Prayers and blessings were offered not just out of gratitude, but in hope a plea for mercy, a wish for another day of safety, and that the meal survived. The development of trust in growers, in sellers, and cooks was crucial, but always provisional, always tinged with doubt. Rumors of illness, stories of unscrupulous merchants, outbreaks that swept through neighborhoods or entire towns, all of these shaped the reputations of individuals and markets, all influenced where and how people bought and ate. In cities, new regulations arose to combat fraud and contamination, but enforcement was uneven, and loopholes easily exploited. In rural areas, tradition and reputation held more sway, but could just as easily conceal risks as expose them. Through all these small acts of the sniffing of a jug, the careful cutting of cheese, the questioning of a neighbor, people navigated the dangers of their world, guided by memory, instinct, and the stories that circulated, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, always remembered. For children and the vulnerable, the dangers of food were magnified. The young, the old, the sick of those least able to protect themselves were often the first to suffer, their bodies unprepared for the assaults of poison or infection. Parents and guardians bore the burden of vigilance, striving to shield their loved ones from harm in a world that offered few guarantees. In many societies, the feeding of children was surrounded by rules and warnings. Certain foods were forbidden until a certain age, certain plants or meats reserved for the strong and healthy, others offered only after careful preparation. Even so, the line between safe and dangerous was always shifting, and each family accumulated its own set of hard-earned lessons. Stories of illnesses narrowly survived while lives lost despite every precaution. Outbreaks of foodborne illness could devastate entire communities, their effects most keenly felt among those least able to recover. In orphanages and almshouses, in hospitals and crowded tenements, the arrival of tainted milk or meat could sweep through rooms and wards with terrifying speed. Public health, still a new and uncertain field, struggled to keep pace with the realities of poverty, ignorance, and neglect. Yet even in these grim circumstances, people adapted. Simple remedies of boiling water, toasting bread, feeding infants diluted wine or weak beer in place of suspect milk became part of the toolkit of survival. In some places, special foods were reserved for the sick, broths and gruels believed to strengthen the body and protect against unseen threats. The role of caregivers, so often overlooked, was central, their wisdom and attention shaping the destinies of those in their charge. The vulnerability of children, the sorrow of preventable loss, the hope embodied in each small, healthy life, all these threads are woven through the story of dangerous foods, reminders of both the fragility and resilience that define the human experience. The passage of time, the advance of science, and the accumulation of knowledge have not erased the risks of food, but they have transformed them, rendering some dangers distant memories and others newly relevant. In the modern world, where abundance is often taken for granted, where supermarkets and restaurants offer endless choice, the dangers have shifted, becoming less visible but, in some cases, more insidious. Processed foods, preserved for months or years, carry risks not of immediate poisoning, but of long-term harm of the slow accumulation of chemicals, the hidden dangers of salt, sugar, fat, and artificial additives. The rise of allergies and intolerances, the explosion of diet-related diseases, the constant warnings about pesticides and microplastics all testify to the fact that, for all its advances, the art of eating remains fraught with uncertainty. Scandals continue to erupt: meat tainted with disease, vegetables contaminated with bacteria, recalls that reach across continents in a matter of days. The complexity of global supply chains, the sheer scale of modern food production, magnifies every mistake, every oversight, every act of negligence or malice. Consumers, overwhelmed by information and choice, turn once again to the strategies of the past with caution, skepticism, reliance on trusted sources, and, sometimes, the comfort of tradition. Yet, for all these new risks, the progress is undeniable. Infant mortality has plummeted, the great epidemics of the past have receded, and millions enjoy a level of food safety and security unimaginable to their ancestors. The balance of risk has shifted, but not vanished. The story of dangerous foods, though changed, is far from over. The lessons of history remain as relevant as ever. Knowledge is protection, vigilance is survival, and the choices made at the table, however ordinary they may seem, are always, in some way, a matter of life and death. And so, the story circles back to its beginning. The act of eating, so simple and so complex, so essential and so perilous, is both an individual and a collective endeavour. Each bite taken is the product of countless choices and calculations, each meal the result of tradition, adaptation, and the ever-present negotiation with risk. The foods that once killed mushrooms, shellfish, spoiled grains, tainted meats are now, for many, the stuff of legend or curiosity. The rituals and precautions that once governed daily life have become, in some places, little more than relics, their wisdom lost or ignored. Yet in other parts of the world, and for the most vulnerable everywhere, the dangers persist, the risks as real and immediate as ever. To eat is to participate in a history that stretches back to the dawn of humanity, a history marked by suffering and survival, by creativity and caution. Every recipe is a memory, every tradition a shield, every innovation a double-edged sword. In the quiet moments before a meal, in the gathering of families and friends, in the breaking of bread or the sharing of a cup, there is an unspoken acknowledgement of the miracle and the danger that underlie even the simplest act of nourishment. It is this awareness, shaped by centuries of experience, that gives meaning to the ordinary, that transforms food from mere sustenance into story, into culture, into the fabric of life itself. As the sun sets on this long journey through the dangerous fruits of history, it is worth reflecting on the paradox that lies at the heart of human eating. The very things that threatened our existence, the poisonous plant, the spoiled fish, the contaminated water, have also driven the development of knowledge, of culture, of the technologies and traditions that define us. In the struggle to survive, people have learned not only to avoid what can kill, but to embrace, adapt, and sometimes even celebrate what was once feared. The transformation of bitterroot into staple food, of sour milk into cheese, of lethal mushroom into delicacy, speaks to creativity and perseverance unmatched in the animal world. The stories of survival are not just tales of avoidance, but of engagement, of daring, of hope. And as new challenges arise, as the boundaries of safety and danger continue to shift, the story of food endures open-ended, unfinished, written daily in kitchens and fields, in markets and laboratories, in the choices and customs of people everywhere. The dangers of the past are never truly past, they are present transformed, remembered in every act of eating, in every bite and sip. So, let us eat with awareness, with gratitude, with respect for the long and often perilous road that has brought us to this table. Let us honor the courage of those who suffered and learned, who experimented and endured, whose wisdom and caution make each meal possible. And let us never forget that, in the simple act of eating, we participate in a story as old as humanity, a story of danger and delight, of loss and renewal, of life itself. In tracing the hidden threads of danger through the tapestry of human eating, it becomes clear that no region, no culture, no historical period has been immune to the risks and uncertainties that accompany the pursuit of nourishment. Each continent, each climate, each civilization has wrestled with its own particular hazards, the unique poisons of its land, the special challenges of its seasons, the mysterious illnesses that haunted its markets and feasts. The geography of danger is as varied as the geography of taste. In the tropics, for example, the abundance of fruits and plants brought with it a proliferation of toxic species, some brightly coloured and alluring, others dull and easily overlooked. The cassava root, staple of so many diets, conceals cyanide behind its starchy flesh, a threat mastered only by those who learn the rituals of soaking, grating, fermenting, and boiling. In Africa, the ackee fruit, beloved and feared, could bring sudden death if eaten unripe, its glossy seeds releasing a toxin that devastated families and villages before its secrets were understood. In Asia, the starfruit, so innocuous in appearance, could prove fatal to those with kidney ailments, a danger invisible to the eye but devastating in effect. The deserts offered their own tests. Prickly pear cactus, whose sweet flesh-quenched thirst was surrounded by spines and hidden toxins, the wrong preparation could turn a treat into a torment. In the Australian outback, native peoples learned over millennia how to detoxify seeds and nuts that, to newcomers, brought nothing but sickness. The land, unforgiving and beautiful, demanded attention and respect, rewarding only those who listened to its lessons. The Arctic, too, presented a unique landscape of risk. The scarcity of plant foods led to a reliance on animal meat and fat, but with this came the dangers of botulism, of parasites, of vitamin imbalances that could cripple or kill. Traditional knowledge, passed down in stories and ceremonies, guided the Inuit and other northern peoples in their choices which fish to eat raw, which to cook, which to avoid entirely. The line between survival and disaster was drawn by the thinnest of margins, and each mistake could be fatal. Urban life brought new perils, new uncertainties. The teeming cities of Europe and Asia, with their crowds and commerce, fostered an environment in which contamination and fraud flourished. Adulteration of food with chalk, sawdust, or toxic dyes became so common in the 19th century that entire industries sprang up to combat it, and newspapers filled with warnings and scandals. Yet for the poor, the choice was often not between safe and dangerous, but between eating and starving. All these landscapes, all these choices, all these dangers, together they form the true map of humanity's encounter with food. It is not only what is eaten, but where, and by whom, and under what circumstances, that determines whether a meal nourishes or destroys. The dangers of food are universal, but their forms and their lessons are always particular, always local, always shaped by the world in which people live. Among the most gripping stories in the long chronicle of dangerous foods are the notorious cases of mass poisoning and moments when entire communities, cities, or even nations were struck down by a single catastrophic mistake. These tragedies, often remembered for generations, became cautionary tales shaping laws, customs, and the collective memory of societies. One of the most famous episodes took place in Pont-Saint-Sprit, France, in 1951, when more than 200 people fell ill after eating bread from the local bakery. The symptoms were bizarre and terrifying: hallucinations, convulsions, burning sensations, madness. Some ran naked through the streets, others threw themselves from windows or were seized by violent paranoia. In the end, at least 7 died, and many were left permanently scarred in mind and body. The cause, as later investigations suggested, was targeted at the same fungus that had haunted European bread for centuries, but theories of government experiments and chemical contamination persisted for decades, a testament to the enduring mystery and fear that surround foodborne disaster. Other outbreaks, less sensational but no less deadly, have marked every era. In 18th century England, entire families were felled by oxalate flour, an accident of storage that went undetected until too late. In 20th century Japan, outbreaks of Minamoto disease caused by mercury-tainted fish devastated fishing communities, the effects lingering for generations. In the United States, the early days of industrial food production saw outbreaks of botulism from improperly canned vegetables, of listeria in soft cheeses, of salmonella in eggs and poultry. These mass poisonings forced societies to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of their food supply, the dangers of ignorance and neglect, the need for regulation and vigilance. Laws were passed, inspections instituted, new technologies developed to detect and eliminate hazards before they could strike. But each tragedy left its mark, a scar that reminded all who remembered of the price of complacency. Mass poisonings, though less common today, have not disappeared. Globalization, with its complex supply chains and vast reach, means that a single mistake can now affect millions in a matter of days. Recalls of contaminated food, warnings of outbreaks, the anxious scanning of headlines for the next crisis, all these are part of the modern legacy of a problem as old as eating itself. The collective memory of disaster shapes the present as surely as it shaped the past, a constant reminder that safety is never absolute, that vigilance can never end. Some of the most fascinating stories in the world of dangerous foods come not from accidents or ignorance, but from the deliberate, even enthusiastic, embrace of risk. The search for excitement, novelty, and the thrill of the forbidden has led people to eat what others fear, to seek out delicacies that demand courage as well as appetite to transform danger into pleasure. The love of spicy food, for example, is a global phenomenon. The fiery heat of chili peppers, a defense mechanism evolved to deter predators, is now celebrated in cuisines from Mexico to Thailand, from India to Hungary. For some, the burning pain is itself a delight, a challenge to be conquered, a source of pride and camaraderie. Yet behind the pleasure lies risk for those unaccustomed, or in fragile health. The consequences can be severe, ranging from digestive distress to, in rare cases, death. Fermented and aged foods, so essential to the culinary traditions of many cultures, are another realm where pleasure and danger mingle. The odor of Söster Iming, the soft, living mass of Cajun mazu, the acrid sting of fermented tofu or century eggs, all these foods are loved by some, reviled by others, their dangers carefully managed by those who know the rituals and risks. To eat such delicacies is not only to enjoy their flavor, but to participate in a tradition that acknowledges and embraces the dangers of the unknown. Even the world of desserts has a share of risk. The Japanese delicacy of matcha, for example, has claimed the lives of many, especially the elderly and young, who have choked on its sticky, glutinous texture. In parts of the world where peanuts or other allergens are common, a bite of cake or a spoonful of ice cream can bring swift and deadly consequences. The dangers of pleasure are real, their boundaries marked not by the taste buds, but by the body's fragile machinery. The willingness to court risk to celebrate the dangerous and the forbidden is a testament to the complexity of human appetite. Food is not only sustenance, but excitement, identity, memory, and joy. The story of dangerous foods is, in this sense, a story of daring of people who, knowing the hazards, choose to taste, to experiment, savor what others avoid. The thrill of danger, when managed and understood, becomes another kind of nourishment, another way of being alive. As the world moves ever forward, the frontiers of food and danger continue to expand, shaped by science, technology, and the restless curiosity of the human mind. New foods are invented in laboratories, designed to nourish, delight, or heal. Ancient foods are rediscovered and reimagined for new generations. Yet with every innovation, every discovery, new dangers emerge, new risks that must be understood and managed. Lab-grown meats, for example, promise a future free from the horrors of factory farming, a cleaner, safer, more ethical source of protein. But what unforeseen consequences might follow? What hidden dangers might lurk in the cells, the additives, the processes of creation? Genetically modified crops, designed to resist pests and drought, have sparked fierce debate about safety, ecology, and the meaning of natural food. The boundaries between food and medicine blur, as supplements, fortified products, and nutraceuticals promise health but sometimes deliver harm. Even the old dangers take new forms. The rise of antibiotic resistance, fostered by overuse in agriculture, threatens to bring back plagues once thought conquered. The explosion of allergies and intolerances, perhaps the result of changes in environment or diet, presents challenges for families, schools, and entire societies. The threat of bioterrorism, the deliberate contamination of food for political ends, is a modern spectre, once confined to fiction, now the subject of real-world preparation and fear. The story of dangerous foods, then, is never finished. It evolves with each new discovery, each new invention, each new mistake. The work of vigilance, of learning, of adaptation is never done. Yet, for all the risks, the promise remains, the possibility of a world in which food is not only safe, but abundant, nourishing, and shared by all. This is the challenge of the present, and the hope for the future, to remember the lessons of the past, to embrace the possibilities of the new, to balance curiosity with caution, and to ensure that, for generations to come, the table remains a place not only of risk, but of celebration and life. The archives of food history are dotted with stories of individuals whose lives and deaths have become synonymous with the perils of eating. Some are remembered for their recklessness, others for their curiosity, and still others simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. These personal tales bring the vast narrative of dangerous foods into sharp human focus, reminding us that behind every tradition, every law, every superstition, there are real people with real hopes, fears, and fate shaped by the things they ate. One such figure is the Roman emperor Claudius, whose death, according to ancient chroniclers, was hastened by a meal of poisoned mushrooms. Whether the deed was done by accident or conspiracy remains debated, but the story has endured for 2 millennia, a lesson in the vulnerability of even the most powerful to the dangers lurking on the dinner table. The image of Claudius enjoying a favourite dish, unaware that his last meal would become his most famous, is haunting, a testament to the unpredictable nature of risk. Another is the tale of John Smeaton, a celebrated British engineer who died not by design, but through misfortune. In 1792, while inspecting flood defences in Yorkshire, Smeaton consumed a meal of what he thought were edible roots, only to discover too late that they were hemlock, the very plant that had claimed the life of Socrates centuries before. His passing, mourned by many, was a reminder that knowledge, no matter how vast in one field, does not always protect against the hazards of another. There are stories, too, of anonymous victims, peasants and townsfolk, soldiers and travellers whose names are lost but whose experiences echo through folklore and cautionary tales. The peasant who, driven by famine, ate a stew of wild herbs and perished before dawn, the child who picked berries from the wrong bush, trusting in colour and sweetness, unaware of the poison within, the merchant whose cheese, lovingly aged, harboured an invisible mould that brought fever to the whole family. Sometimes the act of survival itself becomes legendary. In the Arctic, the explorer who, starving and desperate, ate polar bear liver and was stricken by vitamin toxicity, lived long enough to tell others never to make the same mistake. In the Pacific Islands, shipwrecked sailors who survived weeks on unfamiliar fruits and fish learned through suffering what was safe and what must be avoided, passing on their lessons in journals and letters. These stories, whether tragic or triumphant, are the living heart of the history of dangerous foods. They remind us that the pursuit of nourishment is always personal, always shaped by the choices and circumstances of individuals. In the failures, we find warnings; in their perseverance, hope; in their curiosity, the spark that drives humanity forward, ever searching, ever tasting, ever risking, and ever surviving. Beyond individual tragedies and triumphs, dangerous foods have shaped the destinies of entire communities and even nations. The spread of diseases like ergotism, caused by contaminated rye, or pellagra, brought by a diet reliant on unixtamalized maize, have profound effects on the course of history. Outbreaks of foodborne illness sometimes tip the balance of wars, decimated populations, or spark social upheaval and change. In medieval Europe, recurring waves of St. Anthony's fire, the popular name for ergot poisoning, not only caused suffering, but also gave rise to religious movements, charitable hospitals, and the veneration of saints believed to protect against the affliction. The social responses to these outbreaks, shaped by a mixture of faith and desperation, fostered new networks of care and solidarity, but also fed suspicion and persecution as communities searched for scapegoats to explain their suffering. In the American South, the scourge of pellagra, a disease marked by rashes, insanity, and ultimately death that baffled doctors for decades, its origins misunderstood and its victims often blamed for their own misfortune. Only in the 20th century did scientists uncover the link between pellagra and a diet lacking niacin, leading to changes in agricultural practice, food fortification, and public health policy that transformed the lives of millions. The Irish potato famine, while rooted in crop failure, was also a story of dangerous food, of reliance on a single variety vulnerable to disease, and of the desperate consumption of rotten or diseased tubers as starvation loomed. The famine's legacy is written in the migrations it provoked, the reforms it spurred, and the collective memory of risk and resilience it left behind. The saga of dangerous foods, then, is not only a matter of private risk, but of collective fate. It shapes economies, alters political structures, and leaves marks on the very identity of peoples. The lessons learned from these communal experiences are the importance of diversity, the necessity of vigilance, the value of shared knowledge continue to inform the ways in which societies approach the challenge of eating safely in an ever-changing world. Folklore and myth have long been woven around the subject of food and its dangers. In every culture, stories abound of enchanted fruits, cursed feasts, magical banquets, and the mysterious deaths of those who dared eat without proper care. These tales, though sometimes dismissed as superstition, are, in their own way, repositories of hard-won knowledge of warnings encoded in narrative, caution embedded in wonder. In Slavic lands, the forest was said to be haunted by spirits who would lead the unwary to eat poisonous mushrooms, a punishment for greed or disrespect. In the tales of the Brothers Grimm and their contemporaries, children lured by sweets or forbidden foods found themselves trapped or transformed, a metaphor for the hazards lurking in every tempting bite. In China, stories of mortals and scholars often feature banquets at which a single mistake, a misidentified or a tainted cup brings disaster. These myths served a double purpose, to entertain, but also to instruct, to pass on lessons about the dangers of the natural world, the importance of caution, and the value of tradition. The figure of the wise woman or cunning man, able to distinguish the safe from the deadly, recurs again and again, a symbol of the knowledge required to survive. Even in the modern age, urban legends about deadly foods persist. Stories circulate about the poisonous seeds of apples or cherries, the dangers of mixing shellfish with certain wines, the mysterious effects of unfamiliar spices. While many of these tales are exaggerated or unfounded, their persistence speaks to a deep-seated anxiety about the act of eating, or recognition that the boundary between safety and danger is never entirely secure. In every age, in every place, the folklore of food reminds people of the lessons of the past, of the need for vigilance, and of the wisdom encoded in story and song. The ritual of eating, repeated day after day, is at once ordinary and profound. Across the globe, mealtimes mark the rhythms of life beginnings and endings, celebrations and mournings, moments of communion and solitude. The rituals that surround food, from the simplest blessing to the most elaborate banquet, serve not only to nourish the body, but to create meaning, to forge connection, to shape identity. In many cultures, the sharing of food is an act of trust, a gesture that transforms the dangers into the safe. The communal bowl, the family table, the potluck feast, all these are strategies for spreading risk, for ensuring that, should misfortune strike, it is faced together. The act of feeding others, of accepting what is offered, is a statement of faith in the skills, the care, the wisdom of the community. Other rituals, more private but no less significant, are shaped by memory and experience. The careful checking of labels, the boiling of water, the avoidance of certain foods during particular seasons or illnesses, these habits, often unspoken, are the inheritance of generations. The simple act of washing hands, so ordinary as to be invisible, is a ritual born of the long struggle against unseen enemies, a triumph of experience over oblivion. Celebratory meals at weddings, festivals, rites of passage are times when the pleasures of food are magnified, but so too are the risks. Special dishes, prepared only rarely, require skills that may have grown rusty, unfamiliar ingredients sourced from afar introduce new uncertainties. The balance between tradition and innovation, between the known and the new, is always delicate. Through it all, the rituals of eating serve to anchor people in a world of uncertainty. They provide comfort, structure, and a sense of belonging. They are a bulwark against the dangers, both seen and unseen, that accompany the act of nourishment. In the kitchens of history, innovation has often been driven by necessity, and necessity, in turn, has been shaped by the ever-present spectre of danger. From the simplest hearth to the grandest palace, cooks have worked to outwit the threats that lurk in every ingredient, transforming the raw and the risky into the delicious and the safe. Their tools have changed with time, from stone mortars and wooden spoons to gleaming knives and digital thermometers, but their purposes remain constant: to create meals that sustain, comfort, and protect. The evolution of culinary technique is, at its heart, a record of adaptation and problem-solving. The practice of boiling water, for example, emerged in many cultures not only for its ability to soften grains and tough cuts of meat, but for its power to destroy unseen pathogens. The development of fermentation and pickling, so central to the cuisines of Asia, Europe, and Africa, was a response to the need to preserve food in times of abundance and to render the inedible palatable and safe. Roasting and smoking, techniques dating back to prehistoric times, served as both celebration and safeguard, marking festive occasions while eliminating bacteria and parasites. The use of spices and herbs, sometimes dismissed as mere flavoring, was often rooted in medicinal knowledge. Garlic, ginger, and pepper, among others, possessed natural antimicrobial properties that contributed as much to safety as to taste. Culinary wisdom, handed down through apprenticeship and observation, became a precious resource. In many societies, the head cook was second in authority only to the head of household, entrusted with the health and well-being of all. Mistakes were costly, sometimes deadly, and the stories of failed experiments, botched recipes, and near misses accumulated alongside the family as favourite dishes. As trade expanded and empires grew, kitchens became laboratories for cross-cultural exchange. The introduction of new fruits, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, sugar required new knowledge, new techniques, and a willingness to experiment despite the risks. Failures, sometimes disastrous, were inevitable, but so too were the discoveries that transformed diets, economies, and ways of life. Today, the work of kitchen safety is supported by science and technology, by training, regulation, and research. Yet the heart of the matter remains unchanged. Cooks, professional and amateur alike, are the last line of defense between the world as dangers and the table as pleasures. Their vigilance, creativity, and dedication are as important now as they have ever been. Within every family, the history of dangerous foods is preserved not only in stories and customs, but in the everyday acts of care and caution that define domestic life. The knowledge of what to eat, when to eat, and how to prepare it safely is often learned apparentes ni, passed from generation to generation with the same seriousness as any inheritance. Mothers, fathers, grandparents all become guardians of culinary memory, their habits and advice shaped by experiences both bitter and sweet. The insistence on washing lettuce, the reluctance to serve shellfish in summer, the refusal to keep leftovers more than a day or two, all these are echoes of dangers faced and sometimes barely avoided. A grandmother's tale of the time she fell ill after eating wild mushrooms, or a father's warning about the dangers of raw milk, become part of the family's collective wisdom. These lessons are often heeded without thought, woven into the fabric of daily life. They influence shopping choices, cooking methods, and the rhythm of meals. In some cases, they become sources of tension as younger generations question or resist the old ways, eager to embrace new foods and ideas. Yet even as traditions evolve, the core message endures: the world is full of uncertainty, and food, for all its comforts, is never entirely without risk. Family meals, whether grand or humble, are occasions for both joy and vigilance. The laughter that rings out at the table is underpinned by the quiet assurance that the food is safe, that those who prepared it took every precaution. The rituals of thanks, the careful dividing of portions, the quiet watching of children as they taste a new dish all speak to the ongoing negotiation between love, caution, and necessity. In this way, the history of dangerous foods is always personal. It is written in the gestures and choices of everyday life, in the recipes handed down, in the warnings remembered and sometimes ignored. It is a story without end, unfolding each time a meal is shared, each time a new generation takes its place at the table. The literature and art of every culture bear witness to the role of dangerous foods in shaping imagination and identity. From ancient epics to modern novels, from still life paintings to satirical cartoons, food is depicted not only as a source of pleasure and abundance, but also as an arena of risk, temptation, and sometimes tragedy. In Homer's Odyssey, the consumption of the lotus flower lulls men into forgetfulness, while the deadly banquet of the suitors brings retribution and death. In Shakespeare's plays, poisoned goblets and tainted feasts are devices for both drama and moral instruction, symbols of treachery, fate, and the unpredictability of life. Painters of the Renaissance and Baroque eras filled their canvases with the bounty of the table, yet close inspection often reveals hints of decay, rot, a warning of a fly on a peach, a worm in a fig, a glass turned cloudy with spoilage. These details, subtle but deliberate, remind the viewer that beauty and danger, pleasure and peril are inseparable companions. Folklore, too, is rich with stories in which food is the means of transformation, punishment, or salvation. Witches tempt children with sweets, kings are tested by strange banquets, heroes win or lose everything in contests of appetite. These narratives reflect both the centrality of food to human life and the anxiety that comes with each act of eating. In the modern era, books and films continue to explore the dangers of food, whether through tales of survival in the wilderness, exposés of industrial food scandals, or the dystopian visions of societies undone by famine or abundance. Art and story provide a mirror for the fears, hopes, and desires that surround every meal, reminding us that the history of dangerous foods is not only practical, but also profoundly emotional and imaginative. If there is a lesson that emerges from the long and tangled history of dangerous foods, it is that resilience and the ability to learn, adapt, and endure is humanity's greatest ally. Each generation, faced with its own set of threats, builds upon the experience of those who came before, combining caution with curiosity, tradition with innovation to find new ways to survive and thrive. This resilience is evident in the spread of food safety education, in the enforcement of standards and regulations, and in the global networks of scientists, doctors, and cooks who work to identify and neutralize emerging risks. It is visible in the work of community health workers who teach families how to store and prepare food safely, in the activism of those who demand transparency and accountability from producers and sellers, and in the creativity of cooks who devise new recipes and methods to render the dangerous edible. Yet resilience is not only collective, but individual. It is found in the careful shopper who examines each apple, in the parent who boils water for the child, in the elder who remembers which wild plants to avoid. It is a quality that emerges from hardship as much as from plenty, from the memory of suffering as much as from the hope of joy. The challenges of the future are no less daunting than those of the past. Climate change, population growth, and the movement of peoples and fruits across borders introduce new uncertainties, new dangers, and new opportunities for learning and adaptation. The resilience that has carried humanity this far will be needed more than ever as the story of dangerous foods continues to unfold. Every region of the world tells its own unique chapter in the saga of dangerous foods shaped by climate, geography, and centuries of adaptation. In the Andean highland, for instance, the potato, now a global staple, was long regarded with suspicion by European newcomers who failed to recognize its poisonous parts and suffered accordingly. Yet local peoples, through generations of careful trial and error, developed dozens of varieties, along with ingenious methods to neutralize toxins, freezing, drying, and leaching with running water, a choreography of survival practiced with patience and skill. In the rainforests of the Amazon, an astonishing diversity of edible plants and animals beckon and threaten in equal measure. Some nuts and fruits required elaborate rituals of preparation, roasting or soaking to draw out their bitter poisons, while others were safe only in the briefest of seasons, their ripeness measured not just by appearance, but by taste, scent, and tradition. The knowledge of what to eat and when, and how was embedded in language, myth, and everyday practice, a collective memory maintained at the cost of many hard lessons. In Southeast Asia, the tradition of street food is celebrated the world over, yet it also carries with it the risks of spoiled ingredients, contaminated water, and the heat and humidity that foster rapid decay. Vendors learn to navigate these dangers through speed, freshness, and constant vigilance, their reputation staked on every dish sold. The proliferation of markets, food stalls, and communal tables is both a triumph of adaptation and a daily negotiation with invisible threats. In the Middle East and North Africa, spices and preservation techniques, salt, vinegar, sun-drying, fermenting became essential tools for keeping fruit safe in hot, arid climates. These culinary strategies were shaped not only by flavor, but by centuries of battle against rot, insects, and disease. The grand banquets described in literature, the lavish hospitality extended to guest and stranger alike, were built on a foundation of knowledge about what could harm and what could heal. Europe, with its varied climates and deep agricultural traditions, saw the rise of seasonal fruit cycles, religious fasts, and local specialties that reflected both abundance and scarcity. The dangers of ergot, spoiled wine, rancid butter, and tainted shellfish all left their marks on regional cuisines, as did the periodic famines that forced people to eat what was available, no matter the risk. Over time, these dangers inspired both technological innovation and cultural adaptation, from the rise of fruit guilds and early regulations to the creation of cheeses, sausages, and breads designed to last and to be safe. Across all these lands, the common thread is resilience, the endless balancing of caution and creativity, the willingness to risk and the wisdom to remember. The landscape of danger is different in every place, but the story is always, at heart, the same: to eat is to adapt, to experiment, and, sometimes, to pay a price. The history of dangerous foods is also a history of discovery, the slow, often painful realization that even familiar foods can become perilous under the right conditions. Weather, storage, transport, and preparation all play a role, turning the ordinary into the hazardous without warning. Few foods, however, have a history as dramatic as that of grains of wheat, rye, barley, rice upon which civilizations have risen and sometimes fallen. Grain is both the foundation of diets and, in times of hardship, a vector for disease and death. Fungal infections like ergot or smut, invisible to the casual eye, transformed harvests into poison, infestations of insects and rodents destroyed stores or introduced new risks. Droughts and floods forced communities to consume spoiled grain, the toxins within causing illness, madness, and sometimes mass hysteria. Rice, a staple for billions, brought its own dangers not only from parasites and contamination, but from a nutritional trap. In the 19th century, the spread of polished white rice led to epidemics of beriberi in Asia as essential nutrients were stripped away by new milling technology. The quest for purity and beauty, it turned out, could itself become a source of peril, and only the rediscovery of the value of whole grains restored balance and health. The transportation of grain over long distances in carts, ships, trains exposed it to spoilage and the elements, and the development of new technologies, from silos to fumigants, was often driven as much by the desire to prevent disaster as by profit. In times of war, the deliberate destruction or poisoning of grain stores became a weapon, inflicting suffering on whole populations. Yet, for all its dangers, grain has endured as the bedrock of civilization. The rituals of harvest, the care taken in storage and preparation, the communal celebrations that mark planting and reaping all bear witness to the central place of grain in the human story and to the ongoing dance between danger and sustenance. As we stand at the threshold of an uncertain future, the history of dangerous foods offers lessons and warnings, but also inspiration. The world is changing, climate instability threatens crops with new diseases and unpredictable weather, urbanization and migration transform foodways, technology brings marvels, but also new risks, some understood, others still hidden. Climate change, perhaps the greatest challenge of the coming century, will reshape the geography of food and the nature of its dangers. Warmer temperatures foster the spread of pests and pathogens, drought and flood threaten harvests, new crops are introduced to unfamiliar soils and communities. Ancient knowledge may become newly relevant, while new science will be needed to understand and respond to emerging threats. The line between what is safe and what is dangerous will shift again, as it always has. The rapid pace of globalization brings its own dilemmas. Foods from every continent reach every table, the supply chain is long and often opaque. A single mistake can now spread harm across nations. Yet, this same interconnectedness fosters new opportunities for learning and cooperation, for sharing solutions and innovations, for building a global resilience rooted in both memory and invention. The future of food will require not only vigilance, but humility, the willingness to recognize what is not yet known, to respect the limits of tradition and the possibilities of change, to learn from both the trends and tragedies of the past. It will demand new forms of storytelling, of education, warning, and hope to pass on what has been learned to those who will face the risks of tomorrow. To eat will always be to risk, but also to hope, to survive is to remember and to adapt. The history of dangerous foods, then, is not just a warning, but a call to courage, curiosity, and care. At last, as the meal concludes and the story draws near its end, there remains a final reflection that every act of eating, no matter how routine or mundane, connects each of us to an unbroken chain of experience stretching back to the very dawn of humanity. The perils faced by foragers and kings, by farmers and cooks, by children and elders, are woven into the very fabric of our shared life, an inheritance carried quietly in every tradition, every recipe, every act of caution and celebration. The table, whether humble or grand, is a place of memory. Here, the stories of survival and suffering, of joy and sorrow, are enacted and remembered. Here, new dangers are faced and, with luck and wisdom, overcome. The ordinary gesture of breaking bread, of pouring a cup, is thus an act of remembrance and renewal, a testament to the resilience that defines the human journey. As new generations gather to eat, to share, to tell their own stories, the history of dangerous foods lives on, and not as a source of fear, but as a wellspring of gratitude, connection, and resolve. The past is never far from the present. The lessons learned in hardship and hope remain as vital as ever. So let us give thanks for the wisdom and the courage of those who came before, and let us look to the future with both vigilance and wonder, knowing that the story is not finished, that each meal, each bite, each moment at the table adds a new page to the endless chronicle of life. Within the shifting tapestry of food and danger, the role of science and discovery stands as both a shield and a lantern, illuminating old hazards and revealing new ones as humanity's understanding grows. From the first herbalists who catalogued the effects of wild plants to the chemists and microbiologists of modern times, the quest to unravel the mysteries of nourishment and poison has saved countless lives, even as it has exposed the limits of knowledge and the constant threat of the unknown. The 19th century marked a turning point, when the invisible world of bacteria and microbes was unveiled by the pioneering work of scientists such as Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Their discoveries forever changed the way people thought about food, illness, and hygiene. Pasteurization, named for its inventor, became a simple but revolutionary technique, protecting milk and wine from the silent invaders that had brought sickness for generations. The germ theory of disease spread slowly at first, facing skepticism and resistance, but ultimately laid the foundation for the food safety systems that safeguard millions today. Yet for every advance, new challenges had emerged. The detection of toxins from naturally occurring poisons to the byproducts of modern industry has required ever more sensitive instruments, ever more rigorous testing. Food scandals, once confined to local outbreaks, now reach across borders as international trade knits distant markets together in webs of risk and reward. Each breakthrough in detection is met by new threats, each regulation by the ingenuity of those who would profit at the expense of safety. Public health campaigns, waged in schools, marketplaces, and media, are ongoing battles against ignorance and habit. Posters urging the boiling of water, the washing of hands, the proper storage of leftovers, compete with the temptations of convenience, tradition, and denial. Some victories are swift, others require generations of persistence. The lessons of one era become the common sense of the next, yet always there are dangers lurking in complacency. At the frontier of discovery, scientists explore the genetic blueprints of crops and animals, searching for ways to strengthen resistance, to increase yield, to guard against pestilence and famine. But as history has shown, each intervention carries risks of unforeseen consequences that may only emerge with time. The promise of technology is real, but so too is the need for humility, for listening to the wisdom of both past and present. In this ceaseless quest for safety, the collaboration of many scientists, cooks, farmers, lawmakers, and eaters themselves becomes essential. The world of food is too complex, too vital to be left to any one group alone. It is in the union of knowledge, skill, and care that true progress is made, and in the vigilance of all that danger is kept, if not banished, at bay. No discussion of dangerous foods would be complete without turning to the ongoing tension between abundance and inequality, between those for whom danger is a distant memory and those for whom it remains a daily threat. For millions around the world, the question is not whether food is safe, but whether there is food at all. Poverty, conflict, and displacement strip away the protections of science and regulation, exposing the most vulnerable to risks that should have been banished long ago. In refugee camps and slums, in rural villages and urban ghettos, the lessons of history repeat themselves with heartbreaking familiarity. Malnutrition weakens bodies and spirits, the search for sustenance leads to the consumption of unsafe water, spoiled food, wild plants, or whatever can be found. Outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and food poisoning cut through populations already on the brink, their stories all too often lost amid the statistics of crisis. Efforts to provide safe food and water by governments, charities, and international organizations are heroic, yet always insufficient. Supplies can be contaminated in transit, traditions and taboos may clash with well-meaning interventions, and trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. The work of protection must be both immediate and long-term, emergency aid to stave off hunger, and systemic change to ensure lasting security. Yet, even here, the story is not only one of loss, but of resilience. Communities find ways to adapt to share what little they have to educate and support one another. Innovations emerge from necessity, the use of solar disinfection for water, the cultivation of hardy crops, the revival of traditional foods and techniques that offer both nutrition and safety. The struggle against danger is most intense where resources are scarcest, but so too is the ingenuity and determination that define the human spirit. The global story of dangerous fruits is inseparable from the story of inequality. The quest for safety must include not only the pursuit of knowledge and technology, but the fight for justice, for access, for the dignity of every person at every table. Only then can the history of food truly become a story of progress, not just for some, but for all. As we move into an era marked by ever more rapid change, the dangers that surround food become, in some ways, harder to see and easier to forget. Supermarkets and online delivery, refrigeration and preservation give the illusion of safety and permanence. Yet, as new threats arise from antibiotic-resistant bacteria to synthetic contaminants, from supply chain disruptions to climate-induced crop failures, the lessons of the past grow more important, not less. Modern life is filled with paradoxes. Never before have so many had access to so much variety, so much abundance. Yet never before has the complexity of the food system been so great, or the gap between rich and poor so wide. For some, choice is overwhelming, for others, it is a distant dream. The risks may shift from acute poisoning to chronic disease, from scarcity to excess, but they remain real, woven into the everyday act of eating. In the face of these challenges, public awareness and engagement are vital. A choice is made by consumers what to buy, where to eat, how to store and prepare food that matter not only for personal health, but for the health of communities and the planet itself. Food safety, sustainability, and justice are intertwined. The decisions of individuals ripple outward, shaping markets, policies, and futures. Education, transparency, and accountability are the tools of progress. The demand for honest labeling, for rigorous testing, for ethical production practices is a reflection of the hard-won understanding that food is never just food. It is a matter of life and death, of trust and power, of connection and care. The dangers of the past have not disappeared, they have evolved. The challenge now is to recognize them, to learn from them, and to act not in fear, but in hope, and in the shared pursuit of a table that is, at last, safe, abundant, and welcoming to all. In the great banquet of human history, the tale of dangerous food stands as a reminder of the fragility and resilience that lie at the heart of the human condition. Each generation inherits the legacy of risk and adaptation, of mistakes and triumphs, of suffering and joy, and adds its own page to the story. The journey from wild roots and hunted game to supermarkets and global cuisine has been long, winding, and often perilous, but it has also been marked by wonder, creativity, and the unending search for connection and meaning. To eat is to trust in the land, in those who grow and prepare, in the wisdom of ancestors, in the promise of tomorrow. It is an act of faith, renewed with every meal, that the dangers of the world can be faced, managed, and, if not vanquished, at least understood. So, as you sit at your own table, whether humble or grand, alone or in company, in the quiet of morning or the fullness of night, remember that you are part of this unbroken chain. The food before you carries the history of all who came before, the risks they took, the knowledge they gained, the stories they left behind. In every bite, there is danger, but there is also life, and in every act of eating, there is both memory and hope. The story is not finished. The chronicle of dangerous foods, like the human journey itself, goes on into new lands, new discoveries, new dangers, and new delights. May we meet the future with open eyes, with gratitude and caution, with curiosity and care, and may our tables, now and always, be places of both safety and celebration.